January 1945. The snow lay thick over the shattered fields of the Ardennes. Smoke curled from the distant ruins of artillery-battered villages, mixing with the bitter scent of gunpowder and blood. In a makeshift American field hospital, the quiet urgency of survival dominated every corner. Nurses moved swiftly between littered stretchers, their gloved hands steady, their eyes scanning each wounded soldier for the slightest sign of life. German nurses, pressed into service by circumstance, watched from the edge of the room. Their eyes widened at what they could scarcely comprehend. Americans, men they had long regarded as the enemy, treated German soldiers first. No hesitation, no disdain, just precise, methodical care. The Germans, bleeding, shivering, and groaning, were lifted with gentle hands, bandaged, and reassured in a language that was not their own. The nurses' faces betrayed disbelief, a mixture of shock and curiosity. Here, amid the chaos of war, they were witnessing a strange, almost impossible truth, compassion that crossed enemy lines. And in that moment, everything they had understood about honor, duty, and the enemy began to shift. By the winter of 1944, Europe was a continent on fire. The Allies had landed in Normandy months earlier, and the German army was stretched thin, its once formidable lines fractured by sustained air raids, armored thrusts, and relentless infantry assaults. In the Ardennes, the dense forests and rolling hills became the stage for one of the most desperate clashes of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. It was here, amid snow and ruin, that frontline medics and nurses faced the unrelenting human cost of combat. The German military medical system, while structured, was overwhelmed. Field hospitals were under constant threat from artillery and air attacks. Supplies were scarce, and doctors were forced to triage not just based on severity of wounds, but on the strategic value of the soldier. Survival often depended on proximity to treatment, and ideology sometimes dictated whose life was considered worth saving first. In contrast, the American approach, though equally constrained by resources, was guided by a different principle. Following the Geneva Conventions, American medics were trained to treat the wounded based on the immediacy of injury rather than nationality. The focus was on preserving life. Bloody German prisoners on the battlefield were not left to the elements. They were moved, stabilized, and cared for. This was not a propaganda stunt. It was policy, deeply embedded in training manuals and reinforced by commanding officers who insisted that humanity survive even amid the horrors of total war. The American field hospitals themselves were feats of logistical and medical innovation. Tents and hastily converted barns became triage centers, heated by portable stoves and lit by flickering lanterns. Stretchers lined narrow aisles, each bearing a soldier with shattered limbs, frozen fingers, or deep shrapnel wounds. Nurses and medics worked in precise choreography, scanning for vital signs, setting fractures, administering morphine, and documenting each case in methodical ledger books. Every second counted. The contrast between the American and German approaches was striking. Where German medical personnel often acted within a framework of hierarchy and ideological loyalty, American nurses and medics emphasized impartiality and efficiency. It was not uncommon for a young American nurse to lift a wounded German from the snow, whispering words of reassurance in broken German, and move on to the next casualty, leaving no room for judgment. The process was mechanical, yet deeply humane, and it left observers, particularly the German nurses, bewildered. For the German nurses, the shock was both professional and personal. Many had trained in orderly, regimented hospitals, where discipline and loyalty to the Reich dictated every action. To see enemy soldiers treated first, to witness compassion extended to men they had been taught to regard as adversaries, was a moment that challenged not only their expectations but their worldview. Diaries and post-war accounts reveal a common theme: astonishment. These nurses recorded the precision, the speed, and the calm efficiency of American care, often noting that it was unlike anything they had ever witnessed within German medical services. At the same time, the human suffering was impossible to ignore. Soldiers, American and German alike, shivered on makeshift cots, blood seeping through bandages, teeth chattering from fever or frostbite. The air was filled with groans, coughs, and a low murmur of nurses' voices offering reassurance. The work was relentless. Casualties arrived in waves after skirmishes, artillery barges, or bombing runs. The nurses, German and American, were caught in a shared reality, that of life and death unfolding in real time. This backdrop, the harsh winter, shattered landscapes, overwhelmed hospitals, and contrasting medical philosophies, set the stage for the encounter that would profoundly impact the German nurses. Their shock was not born of naivety, but of witnessing a principle in action, that even amid the most brutal conflict, human compassion could defy the boundaries of loyalty, ideology, and national allegiance. In this environment, the moment the Americans treated the wounded Germans first was not simply an act of medicine. It was a statement. It challenged assumptions about honor, enemy conduct, and the moral responsibilities of those who served. And it is within this crucible of war, chaos, and moral clarity that the personal experiences of the German nurses unfolded, shaping their perceptions and leaving an indelible mark on their understanding of what it meant to care for life in wartime. The stage was set. The nurses' shock was only the beginning, a doorway into a deeper exploration of medical ethics, battlefield humanism, and the intersection of ideology and compassion under fire. German nurses on the front lines of late 1944 were a study in disciplined endurance. Often barely out of their teens, they were thrust into the chaos of war hospitals that were far from the orderly wards of civilian clinics. Their days were measured by the arrival of wounded soldiers, sometimes in waves, sometimes trickling in sporadically from skirmishes along the icy forests and villages of the Ardennes. The nurses moved with quiet precision, tending to broken limbs, frostbitten hands, shrapnel wounds, and the deep psychological scars etched into soldiers' faces. Each bandage, each syringe, each whispered word was guided by training, hierarchy, and the unspoken rules of military medical conduct. Yet despite their skill, the German medical system was fractured. Field hospitals were under constant threat from Allied artillery. Supply lines were stretched thin, and ideological influence often dictated the priority of care. Wounded soldiers deemed valuable for the war effort might receive immediate attention, while others, especially prisoners, were left waiting, sometimes to die. Nurses were caught in the tension between their oath to preserve life and the rigid expectations of their superiors. Many diaries reveal exhaustion, fear, and an unspoken moral unease, but few accounts suggest that they anticipated the shock that awaited them. American field hospitals operated under a starkly different philosophy. The Geneva Conventions were not simply guidelines, but operational doctrine. Wounded soldiers, friend or foe, were treated according to the urgency of their injuries. Triage tags, a system introduced earlier in the war, allowed medics to classify the wounded efficiently, ensuring that those in immediate danger of death received priority care. Stretchers were distributed, intravenous lines inserted, morphine administered, and, crucially, nationality did not factor into decisions. A German soldier with a deep chest wound might be treated before a slightly less injured American comrade, an act that left many German observers stunned. The Germans witnessed not only the procedural efficiency, but also the human sensitivity behind the American approach. Nurses would kneel beside a shivering prisoner, hold his hand, speak softly in broken German, or adjust his blankets with care. Field surgeons performed delicate procedures in dimly lit tents, sometimes for hours, treating injuries without prejudice. This was a striking contrast to the often hurried, hierarchical methods of German frontline care, where speed, military value, and chain-of-command considerations frequently outweighed individualized attention. For the German nurses, the cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound. They had been trained to see the Americans as the enemy, not only in battle, but in all aspects of human conduct. Now, in these frozen field hospitals, they saw compassion and professionalism extended without discrimination. Their shock was compounded by the efficiency and calm of the American teams. There was no hesitation, no moralizing, only a relentless, almost clinical commitment to preserving life. Beyond the procedural aspects, the nurses were exposed to the human dimension of war in a new way. Soldiers' faces, pale and drawn from pain and cold, revealed the universality of suffering. Their groans, whispered reassurances, and fleeting expressions of relief offered a stark lesson. The enemy was, first and foremost, human. These moments challenged the nurses' assumptions about loyalty, duty, and the moral boundaries of wartime behavior. Many later reflected that it was not the weapons, the uniforms, or the strategies that left the deepest impression. It was the deliberate, ethical choice to prioritize life over ideology. American medics and nurses were also aware of the psychological impact their actions had. By treating German soldiers humanely, they hoped to reduce hatred, foster cooperation when prisoners were eventually captured, and maintain a standard of conduct that aligned with international law. The result was a subtle but powerful shift in the perceptions of those who witnessed it firsthand. German nurses who had endured years of indoctrination and strict military hierarchy found themselves reevaluating the meaning of professionalism, ethics, and empathy in wartime medicine. This confrontation of ideology with humanism set the stage for the nurses' lasting impressions. They observed not only medical techniques, but also the deeper moral choices embedded in every decision. Who to save first, how to comfort the dying, and how to maintain dignity amid chaos. Their shock was not mere surprise. It was the recognition that, even in war, the principles of humanity could triumph over prejudice, fear, and national allegiance. As these experiences unfolded, the German nurses' initial shock gave way to a more complex understanding, one that would influence their reflections long after the battlefield noise had faded. Their story was no longer just about nursing or survival. It was about witnessing a form of ethical courage that transcended lines drawn by war. The human dimension of war is often measured in numbers, casualties, wounded, and survivors. Yet in the field hospitals of the Ardennes, it was measured in expressions, gestures, and quiet moments of care. German nurses, accustomed to prioritizing their own soldiers, were confronted with the startling empathy of American medics. They watched men who had once been portrayed as enemies receive gentle bandaging, morphine for pain, and whispered reassurances. The nurse's astonishment was compounded by the raw vulnerability of the wounded. A soldier, pale and trembling from frostbite, reached for the hand of a nurse he had never met, trusting her instinctively. These moments of human connection transcended ideology and nationality, leaving an indelible mark on the nurse's understanding of compassion in wartime. The nurses themselves were not immune to emotional strain. Their daily work involved trauma, blood, and exhaustion, yet witnessing the Americans' calm and methodical care challenged their assumptions. They began to question the rigid hierarchy and prioritization that had governed their own practices. In diaries and post-war testimonies, many recalled the mixture of confusion, admiration, and unease that filled their hearts as they saw enemy soldiers treated with dignity. This human shock was more than surprise. It was an awakening to the possibility that empathy could exist even in the machinery of war. The Americans' decision to treat wounded enemy soldiers first was not merely ethical. it had strategic implications. Battlefield triage, by definition, focused on preserving as many lives as possible and returning soldiers to combat when feasible. By stabilizing German casualties, Americans reduced the likelihood of these men dying in the field, which, paradoxically, could improve operational efficiency. Wounded soldiers who were captured alive could provide intelligence, lessen resistance, or be exchanged, all of which offered tactical advantages. German nurses observed this dynamic with a mixture of professional curiosity and disbelief. They noted the systematic organization of triage, the precise allocation of limited medical resources, and the prioritization of care based on injury severity rather than nationality. This contrasted sharply with the often ideologically influenced German system, where wounded enemy soldiers could be neglected or left untreated. The Americans' approach demonstrated that humane treatment and battlefield pragmatism were not mutually exclusive, but could coexist to optimize both survival and strategic outcomes. Medical technology on the front lines was rudimentary, yet every tool mattered. American field hospitals employed portable X-ray machines, sterilized surgical kits, and intravenous setups that allowed rapid administration of fluids and pain relief. They relied on systematic triage protocols and portable stretchers designed to transport the injured quickly from battlefield to treatment. For German nurses, the efficiency and availability of these tools was striking. While they were trained in similar techniques, the Americans' combination of organization, innovation, and standardized procedures allowed them to treat wounded soldiers, both friend and foe, with remarkable speed and effectiveness. The nurses noted the improvisational ingenuity as well. Tents converted into surgical theaters, stoves providing heat in freezing winter conditions, and makeshift lighting that enabled night operations. All these elements created an environment where life-saving care could proceed uninterrupted. It was not simply the equipment that impressed the nurses, but the integration of technology, training, and human skill into a system that consistently prioritized survival. These observations expanded the nurses' understanding of what medical efficiency could achieve, even under the most extreme circumstances. The principles guiding American medics were reinforced by leadership at every level. Officers insisted on adherence to triage protocols, the impartial treatment of the wounded, and the maintenance of ethical standards despite the chaos of battle. This top-down commitment ensured that nurses and medics did not falter under pressure and that compassion was codified into operational procedure. German nurses, observing this, recognized a distinct contrast with their own hierarchy. In the German system, decisions were often influenced by ideology, rank, and perceived value to the war effort. Leaders' priorities sometimes conflicted with medical ethics, leaving nurses to navigate a complex moral landscape. Witnessing American leadership that codified humane treatment as non-negotiable revealed to the German nurses a model where ethical imperatives and military efficiency were not in opposition, but mutually reinforcing. From the perspective of German soldiers, the experience was surreal. Many had endured bombardments, frostbite, and exhaustion, only to find themselves lifted from the snow and treated by men they had been trained to fear and despise. They were strangers speaking a foreign language, yet their hands were steady, their care deliberate. Some soldiers later described a momentary disorientation, the instinctive suspicion of an enemy replaced by the startling realization that they were being saved. For the German nurses witnessing this, it was a revelation. The soldiers' quiet gratitude, the visible relief in their eyes, and the fragile trust they extended to their caretakers challenged everything the nurses had understood about loyalty and enemy conduct. This perspective was amplified by the soldiers' own reactions to treatment. Many German men, initially resistant to American care, relaxed under the medics' calm attention. They murmured thanks in broken English or German, allowed procedures to continue without fear, and for the first time, experienced a form of respect that transcended national boundaries. For the nurses observing, the humanization of the enemy added depth to their shock. It was not abstract ethics they were seeing in action, but real lives responding to compassion. The decision to treat enemy soldiers first was a moral choice as much as a medical one. American medics were guided by international law, military ethics, and a professional code that emphasized life preservation above ideology. The Geneva Conventions provided a framework, but implementation required courage and discipline in the field. Every act of care for a German soldier was an affirmation that ethical principles could withstand the pressures of combat. German nurses, trained in obedience and hierarchy, were forced to confront the ethical implications of what they witnessed. Many recorded in diaries a mixture of admiration and unease. Admiration for the Americans' commitment to life. Unease because it contradicted years of indoctrination about the enemy. These ethical choices were not abstract. They were lived experiences, moments where decision and action intersected in the immediacy of life and death. The nurses' shock was thus both emotional and intellectual. It challenged their understanding of right and wrong within the framework of war. The battlefield experience was as much psychological as it was physical. Nurses, soldiers, and medics alike were operating under extreme stress, fatigue, and exposure to trauma. For the German nurses, witnessing enemy-first care introduced a cognitive dissonance. The image of the enemy as cruel, ruthless, or ideologically motivated conflicted with the reality before them. Psychologically, this forced a re-evaluation of deeply ingrained beliefs. The American approach also had a stabilizing effect on the psychological state of both wounded and caregivers. Soldiers treated humanely often exhibited lower levels of panic, anxiety, and despair. Nurses, observing this effect, saw tangible proof that humane treatment could influence morale and resilience. The realization that empathy could survive even amid war's brutality left a lasting impression on the German nurses, one that shaped their professional and moral reflections for years to come. Finally, the Americans' method of treating wounded enemies had broader historical and strategic significance. It demonstrated a disciplined adherence to international norms, projecting an image of ethical conduct that would influence post-war perceptions. Propaganda efforts aside, the actions in field hospitals became part of a legacy, evidence that warfare could incorporate moral principles without sacrificing efficiency. For the German nurses, the experience highlighted the contrast between ideological warfare and pragmatic humanitarianism. The Americans' insistence on impartial care not only saved lives, but subtly undermined assumptions about the enemy. It reinforced a critical lesson of the late war. The nature of combat was evolving, and so too were the ethical responsibilities of those who participated in it. It was the morning of January 17, 1945, when a decisive moment unfolded in the American field hospital near Bastogne. Snow had accumulated overnight, muting the sounds of artillery that still echoed faintly through the surrounding forests. The hospital tents, arranged in hastily constructed rows, were already filled beyond capacity. Wounded soldiers, American and German alike, lay side by side on stretchers, their groans forming a somber, almost rhythmic backdrop to the nurses' hurried movements. The Germans arrived in a steady stream, many frostbitten, some with shattered limbs, others with deep gunshot wounds. Traditionally, these men would have been left to die in makeshift shelters or relegated to secondary care. But the Americans acted differently. Triage was executed with precision. The most severely wounded received attention first, regardless of nationality. A German soldier, barely conscious, was lifted from a snowbank and carried into the tent. His uniform, tattered and bloodied, marked him as an enemy combatant. American nurses and medics moved with clinical efficiency, assessing his injuries, setting splints, and administering morphine. The German nurses watched in disbelief. Their faces reflected a mixture of shock and disbelief as the enemy they had been trained to fear and despise was treated with calm, deliberate care. One nurse, later recalling the scene in her diary, wrote that she could not reconcile the image of the Americans' gentle hands with the violent battlefield from which the soldiers had come. She described the scene as a moment suspended between horror and humanity. It was not only the treatment itself, but the order in which it was given that left an indelible mark. Several severely wounded German soldiers received priority over lightly injured Americans who had been waiting for care. The nurses' internal calculations, based on years of military indoctrination, were overturned in real time. They were forced to witness a principle in action: the preservation of life above all else. The Americans' leadership reinforced this ethic. Officers circulated through the tents, observing the triage process, ensuring adherence to protocols, and emphasizing that moral conduct was inseparable from operational effectiveness. No nurse hesitated, no medic wavered, and no decision favored nationality over medical urgency. The scene was almost mechanical in its precision, yet every act was infused with humanity. As the day progressed, the volume of wounded continued unabated. German prisoners, some conscious, some barely clinging to life, were transported on stretchers, often stabilized within minutes. Nurses noted the meticulous documentation, the careful administration of fluids, and the methodical cleaning and dressing of wounds. They observed how the Americans anticipated complications, checking for infections, adjusting dressings, and monitoring vital signs continuously. The German nurses' shock deepened as they realized that these practices were not reserved for their own soldiers. They were applied to all, friend and foe alike. There were moments of quiet human connection that underscored the drama. One American nurse knelt beside a German soldier with frostbitten hands, speaking softly in halting German, holding his fingers in hers as she ensured proper circulation. Another medic, noticing the same soldier shivering, draped a blanket around him and adjusted a nearby heater. These small gestures, seemingly insignificant, amplified the nurse's astonishment. They were witnessing not just medical competence, but ethical courage expressed in every touch, every word, every careful action. The German nurses began to whisper among themselves, trying to reconcile this display with everything they had been taught. They had lived through years of indoctrination, where the enemy was dehumanized, yet here was evidence to the contrary. Every bandage, every syringe, every measured movement challenged the foundations of their wartime worldview. By midday, the initial shock evolved into a form of engagement. Some nurses stepped closer, offering assistance to American colleagues. They helped lift stretchers, cleaned instruments, and observed surgical procedures, absorbing the techniques and the underlying philosophy of care. The moment became both a crucible and a classroom, a place where skill, ethics, and human empathy converged under the relentless demands of war. And in that convergence lay the turning point. The German nurses' perception of the enemy, of ethical conduct in wartime, and of their own professional identity was irrevocably altered. What had begun as astonishment transformed into reflection, a realization that the principles of humanity could prevail even amidst the most brutal circumstances. The scene closed with the steady hum of activity, the soft moans of the wounded, and the relentless rhythm of nurses moving from stretcher to stretcher. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent to allegiance or ideology, covering both friend and foe alike. Within the tents, however, a quiet revolution had taken place. The ethical treatment of all soldiers had left its mark, and the German nurses would never see battlefield care the same way again. This moment set the stage for the next phase, the resolution of tension the broader consequences for morale and perception, and the lasting impressions left on both the nurses and the soldiers they tended. As the afternoon wore on, the intensity within the tents only increased. Casualties continued to arrive, many brought by stretcher-bearers trudging through deep snow and shell-torn roads. The American nurses and medics, though exhausted, maintained an unwavering focus. They rotated positions, monitored vital signs, and adjusted treatments with a precision that belied the chaos outside. German nurses, initially hesitant observers, now found themselves drawn into the work. Some were tasked with bandaging wounds, others with preparing dressings or administering morphine under supervision. Each action reinforced what they had witnessed in the morning. Competence and humanity were inseparable. The decisive moment reached its zenith when a particularly grievously wounded group arrived. Among them were young German soldiers with deep abdominal and chest wounds, their survival uncertain. American medics immediately triaged them to the highest priority, despite several lightly wounded American soldiers already lying on stretchers nearby. German nurses could scarcely believe what they saw. Protocol, hierarchy, and ideology had long dictated that the enemy should be secondary, yet here, in real time, every decision defied that expectation. A senior American nurse, noting the German observer's shock, spoke quietly to one of them in halting German. "We save life first. Uniform second." The words, simple yet profound, encapsulated the ethos of the day. It was a principle embodied in action: rapid assessment, calm intervention, and unflinching care for every wounded man, regardless of which side he had fought for. The impact on the German soldiers was immediate and visible. Faces contorted by pain softened as medics worked swiftly, checking wounds, administering four fluids, and applying splints. Soldiers who had entered the tents, trembling with fear, now displayed a fragile trust, allowing themselves to be treated without resistance. Some whispered thanks, others nodded silently, but all registered the implicit message. They were seen as human beings first, combatants second. For the nurses, the emotional weight of the scene was undeniable. They were witnessing a form of ethical courage that transcended rank, nationality, and indoctrination. The psychological effect extended beyond the wounded. German nurses found themselves reflecting on their own practices and assumptions. Could care truly be impartial? Could compassion override years of conditioning about loyalty and enemy conduct? Their participation in the triage and treatment process, even peripherally, forced them to confront these questions firsthand. They observed that the American system not only saved lives but reduced chaos, improved morale, and strengthened the integrity of the medical team. Ethical decisions had tactical and human consequences. By late afternoon, a pattern had emerged. Triage was carried out with unerring consistency. Surgical procedures followed strict aseptic protocols, and wounded soldiers, German and American, were stabilized with remarkable efficiency. The German nurses began to take mental notes, recognizing techniques, observing communication patterns, and internalizing lessons that went far beyond mere medical skill. This was education by observation, under the most extreme and morally charged circumstances. The turning point reached its emotional crescendo when a young German soldier, critically wounded and barely conscious, received attention from a pair of American nurses who had never hesitated despite the visible blood and debris. One nurse held his hand, offering gentle words. Another carefully adjusted his blanket and monitored his breathing. The German nurses, standing at the edge of the tent, felt a profound shift. What had seemed impossible moments earlier now appeared inevitable. Ethical action, performed under pressure, could transcend the boundaries of war. As the sun dipped behind the snow-covered trees, the activity in the tents slowed only slightly. The wounded had been stabilized, surgeries concluded where possible, and the most urgent needs met. The German nurses, now fully engaged and forever changed, understood that they had witnessed a turning point not only in the lives of the soldiers, but in their own perceptions of war, humanity, and duty. They had seen a model of care that merged moral courage with professional skill, challenging everything they had previously accepted. Outside, the battlefield remained relentless. Shells still fell in distant forests, patrols moved through snow-laden roads, and the war continued unabated. Yet inside those tents, amid the groans, whispers, and steady hands of American medics, a profound transformation had taken place. The German nurses had been shaken, educated, and morally confronted. The decisive moment, the ethical prioritization of the wounded over allegiance, had left its indelible mark, setting the stage for reflection, aftermath, and the enduring consequences of this extraordinary act of humanity. The days following the events at the American Field Hospital near Bastogne revealed the profound consequences of what had transpired. German nurses, who had entered the tents with skepticism and trained detachment, carried the memory of that day with a mixture of awe and introspection. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal that many could not shake the image of enemy soldiers receiving care before their own comrades, nor the quiet efficiency with which the Americans performed their duties. The nurses' initial shock evolved into a complex understanding that the principles of human decency could survive even amidst the violence of total war. For the German soldiers who had been treated, the impact was immediate and tangible. Survival rates improved markedly compared to previous engagements where wounded prisoners were left unattended or delayed in treatment. Even those who would later return to combat carried the memory of care extended across enemy lines, a subtle, lasting influence on morale and perception. Many soldiers spoke of a newfound respect for the Americans, a grudging recognition of professionalism, and, in some cases, a reassessment of what it meant to fight honorably. Within the field hospital, the German nurses themselves began to adopt certain practices observed in the Americans' approach. They noted the meticulous documentation, the emphasis on triage by injury severity, and the humanizing gestures extended to each patient. Some began to question their own procedures, realizing that efficiency and compassion could coexist. This reflection was not merely academic. It shaped the nurses' future practice, influencing how they treated soldiers and patients in subsequent engagements. The psychological repercussions extended beyond individual experiences. Among the German personnel present, the demonstration of impartial care challenged entrenched beliefs about the enemy and about moral conduct in wartime. The nurses' shock evolved into a form of moral awakening, a recognition that ethical choices could be enacted even under extreme pressure. This realization had broader implications. It offered proof that professional standards and personal ethics could influence the conduct of war itself. At the strategic level, the Americans' actions reinforced the principles of the Geneva Conventions in practice. By prioritizing care according to injury rather than allegiance, they not only preserved life, but demonstrated a disciplined commitment to international norms. This, in turn, shaped post-war narratives about the conduct of American forces, reinforcing the perception of ethical and humane treatment of enemy combatants. For the German nurses, witnessing this became a living example of how adherence to ethical principles could coexist with military necessity, creating a lasting impression that outlived the immediate battlefield. Furthermore, the event highlighted the interplay between ethics, morale, and operational effectiveness. Wounded soldiers who were treated humanely, whether friend or foe, were more likely to cooperate, less likely to resist medical personnel, and more likely to survive. The American model demonstrated that humane care could have tangible tactical benefits, a lesson not lost on the observers who would carry this knowledge back into their own systems. The aftermath was also marked by subtle but profound shifts in interpersonal dynamics. German nurses, once wary and distant, found themselves collaborating with American colleagues in subsequent medical operations. Even limited cooperation facilitated the sharing of techniques, organization strategies, and ethical frameworks. These interactions reinforced the understanding that the battlefield, while brutal, could also be a space of learning, reflection, and moral engagement. In short, the immediate aftermath of that January day revealed the ripple effects of a single principle enacted under fire: the prioritization of life above ideology. The German nurses were shaken, but not broken. They were confronted with a model of humanity that left lasting impressions on their practice, their worldview, and their perception of the enemy. What had begun as disbelief had matured into respect, reflection, and a recognition of the moral and professional stakes of wartime medical care. The story was far from over. The broader implications on morale, reputation, and the psychological landscape of both American and German forces continued to unfold, setting the stage for the next phase: the full aftermath and the enduring legacy of these extraordinary actions. In the weeks that followed, the impact of the Americans' battlefield triage extended beyond the immediate hospital tents. German nurses carried the memory of that day into other facilities, retelling the events to colleagues, discussing techniques, and reflecting on the ethical choices they had witnessed. The story of wounded enemies treated first became a point of quiet conversation, an anomaly in the rigid framework of military expectation that challenged traditional notions of duty and allegiance. For the German soldiers, the experience had a lingering psychological effect. Those who survived under American care often reported a sense of cautious respect for their captors. Even amidst the larger horrors of the Ardennes campaign, where artillery, cold, and exhaustion defined life, the memory of being treated humanely persisted. It influenced interactions with medical personnel, fostered cooperation, and in some cases softened the perception of the Americans as purely adversarial. In a war defined by hatred and suspicion, these moments of impartial care left subtle but undeniable imprints on the psyche of both soldiers and observers. The American medics themselves recognized the broader implications. Their commitment to impartial care upheld the Geneva Conventions and reinforced an image of discipline and humanity that contrasted sharply with the often brutal treatment reported elsewhere. This demonstration of ethical conduct resonated beyond the immediate battlefield. Field reports, diaries, and after-action analyses highlighted how prioritizing life above nationality could maintain morale, reduce resistance, and preserve professional integrity even in high-pressure combat zones. German nurses, absorbing these lessons, began to understand the larger significance. The actions of the Americans illustrated that wartime ethics were not abstract ideals, but operational principles with real consequences. By observing triage based on injury severity, the nurses witnessed a system where efficiency, morality, and human empathy converged. The shock they initially felt transformed into a nuanced recognition that care could be principled, impartial, and effective simultaneously. This event also influenced perceptions of leadership and authority. American officers had codified ethical decision-making as part of the operational structure, ensuring that medics and nurses adhered to principles even under extreme duress. For German nurses, this provided a striking contrast to their own experience, where hierarchy and ideology sometimes dictated the order of care. They observed that leadership could enforce morality as rigorously as it enforced discipline, and that ethical choices could enhance, rather than hinder, operational effectiveness. Beyond the immediate battlefield, these actions contributed to a lasting historical legacy. Stories of ethical battlefield conduct circulated in post-war reports, memoirs, and analyses, shaping perceptions of American military professionalism and influencing the development of medical protocols in subsequent conflicts. The German nurses' experience, while personal and localized, became part of a larger narrative illustrating how adherence to humanitarian principles could persist even in the most brutal circumstances. On a human level, the nurses' reflections reveal an enduring lesson about the power of observation and moral courage. They had witnessed a convergence of technical skill, ethical clarity, and compassionate action that challenged their own assumptions. Their shock, once acute, evolved into understanding, a recognition that the moral dimension of medical care could survive, even flourish, amid the chaos of total war. This insight would inform not only their professional practice, but also their personal reflections for decades after the war ended. The aftermath, then, was multifaceted. Immediate improvements in survival, shifts in psychological perception, lessons in ethical leadership, and a broader historical testament to the endurance of human compassion. The decisive act of treating wounded enemies first was more than a medical procedure. It was a statement about what humanity could endure and achieve even in the midst of conflict. As the war continued beyond the Ardennes, the echoes of that day resonated in the practices, memories, and moral reasoning of those who had witnessed it. The German nurses, forever changed, carried with them an understanding that would shape not only how they saw the enemy, but how they understood their own capacity for empathy, courage, and ethical judgment. In the quiet aftermath of war, the story of that January day in Bastogne endures not for its battles or strategies, but for a simple, profound truth. Humanity can persist even amidst destruction. German nurses, witnesses to the improbable sight of Americans treating wounded enemies first, carried a lesson that transcended the battlefield. They had seen care administered without prejudice, skill paired with compassion, and ethical principles enacted under fire. This moment challenged their assumptions, reshaped their understanding of duty, and left an imprint on their conscience that would endure long after the guns fell silent. The ethical courage displayed by the American medics demonstrated that warfare need not erase morality. Every bandaged limb, every administered syringe, every whispered word of reassurance was an assertion of life over ideology. In that tension between battlefield chaos and calm humanism, a model emerged. One where compassion was a tool of survival and ethics a form of strength. The nurse's shock was not simply an emotional reaction. It was the recognition that principles of decency could endure, even flourish, in the most extreme circumstances. This event also serves as a timeless reminder of the interconnectedness of humanity. The wounded, regardless of uniform, were first and foremost people deserving of care. The observers, the German nurses, learned that empathy could cross the rigid boundaries of nationality and indoctrination. Their experience affirms that moral courage is as vital to victory as strategy, and that acts of ethical choice echo far beyond the moment of decision. In the end, the legacy of that day is quiet but enduring. It is found in the notes of nurses' diaries, the memories of soldiers, and the ethical standards that continue to guide military medicine today. Amid war's violence, the smallest acts of humanity, the steady hand, the gentle word, the impartial care, become monuments in themselves. And it is here, in the convergence of duty, ethics, and empathy, that history whispers its most enduring lesson, that even in the darkest moments, humanity can shine.